Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I welcome you to part 4 of our series titled Celebrating Humor and Music, Conversations with Comedians and Musicians from the Past. We are doing these programs in what we call the Chautauqua format. We have a very experienced individual or scholar who has studied this person for a long time, and then they on the program play the role of that person. And therefore, based upon the Chautauqua format, I welcome to the program a very famous humorist, Erma Bombeck, who lived from 1927 until 1996. She's often called one of the greatest humorists America has produced in the last 50 years. And she was a journalist at the Dayton Herald in Ohio, and from that she became a syndicated columnist in over 700 newspapers. She also appeared for a number of years on ABC News show Good Morning America, and in addition to that was the author of a number of books. With that introduction, Ms. Bombeck, welcome to the program. We're pleased to have you here in our time in the year 2007.
I am so pleased to be here, Tony. I had a wonderful time this morning with your audience, and I thank you for inviting me to be one of your speakers.
Well, you've honored us with that process. And as always, I'm pleased to welcome our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who will start today's questioning.
Erma Bombeck, you are someone who a lot of people know about, but they probably don't know about your family and your background. How did you get started in your work?
Well, I grew up in a working class neighborhood. My parents, my mother, Erma, had a 6th grade education. My father, Cassius, a 4th grade education. And he died when I was very young. He was 9 years old. And I think I became interested in reading the then contemporary humorists, people like Robert Benchley and James Thurber. My father's death had a tremendous impact on me, and I think I really needed the humor at that time. And it was a great escape for me. Because I always loved the humorous, and English was my favorite subject. I mean, I did very well in my English classes, and it just seemed a natural for me to write and to write humor. It was always a part.
Did you go on to college?
I did. I went to Ohio University, where I was a dismal failure. I can tell you I had a year there and went home with... I hate to say it, but pretty poor grades. And then I saved enough money to attend Dayton University, which was a private Catholic school. And there I did extremely well. So I think it was the environment. It was a smaller, closer school. I had a lot of personal attention. And I remember Brother Tom Price encouraged me tremendously in my writing. I wrote for the school paper. And it was a glorious 4 years there.
Did you meet a special young man while you were there?
I met a special young man when I was in high school. Bill Bombeck and I dated a couple of times in high school, and then he went off to the service. And when he came out of the service and I had graduated, we got together again. He loved the letters I wrote him. He said they were the funniest letters that he had received. And I think it was my humor that charmed him to the chapel. And we were married when we were 21 years old, which takes a lot of courage, I think, or stupidity, one or the other.
You had 3 children, and
3?
Because that's important because both your husband and your children became part of your humor. What I'd like to do on the rest of the program today is to take advantage of that humor. Janelle gave us your background, but we want to get into your writings and your work. And I don't know hardly how to go there so many ways, but let's start with the one on some of the writings you did about the holidays and your least favorite holiday and why people should not trick-or-treat after a certain age.
April. I have to admit, my least favorite holiday is Halloween. I place it somewhere between April 15th, tax time, and New Year's Eve without a babysitter. Halloween, if you live in the suburbs, is a full-scale invasion. And I've always noticed that after about 9 o'clock, that the trick-or-treaters get older, they're less interested in costumes, and their demands are more aggressive. So after 9 o'clock, I'd go to the door with a candy bowl in one hand and a baseball bat in the other, because I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to encounter. I have always maintained that there are certain adolescents who are a little too old to be trick-or-treating, and I offered 5 rules for maybe that you should reconsider trick-or-treating if you fall into one of these categories. And one of them is that you should never trick-or-treat if you can drive yourself to the suburbs. You should never trick-or-treat if when you open your mouth and ask for a treat, your voice cracks. That means your voice is changing, you're too old. You should never trick-or-treat if you reach your hand into the candy bowl and your cigarettes fall out of your pocket. You should never trick-or-treat if you have a personal message on your trick-or-treat bag that says, "I accept personal checks." And you should never trick-or-treat if the woman who hands you the treat turns you on more than the treat that she gives you.
Those are, again, Ms. Bombeck, that's your humor. I think why you're so popular is because it's everyday life issues that people can identify with. I want to do one more before we go back to Janelle Burke, and that has to do with your children, or anyone's children, and when they're trying to get out of things, just take out the garbage, whatever. You talked about today in your lecture that what the most popular room in the house and why.
Oh, yes. The most popular room in the house for children is always the bathroom. The most interesting things occur in any home, I think, in the bathroom. I can remember one time the house was totally silent, and when you have 3 children and you have a silent home, you're in trouble. So I thought I heard something coming from the bathroom, and I said, "What's going on? Are you in there?" And I heard 3 little voices say, "What's going on in there?" And I said, "Nothing." and then all of a sudden I heard these horrible noises. I mean, the dog was whining, and I had one sibling I could vaguely hear begging for mercy, and there was water running under the door, and there was a sound like 10,000 camels just standing in place, with their feet stomping on the floor. And I thought it was time to call 911. Yes, children seem to find the bathroom a bastion of privacy, and it gives them immunity from ever completing any task or helping. I don't know how many times I've asked one child, will you help me with the groceries? They're out in the car and I need some help. Oh, I'm in the bathroom. Are you in bed? No, I'm in the bathroom. Have you done your homework? I'm in the bathroom. It's just
an escape.
It's an escape. Yes, it's their mountaintop, their preserve,
Thank you so much, Janelle Burke.
Well, Mrs. Bombeck, you must have some books that are your favorites or some writings that are your favorites. What would you suggest to our reading audience if they wanted to read some of your writings? Where would you point them?
Well, I would actually, one of my first bestseller, which is The Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank, is one of my favorites. And then my second one, If Life is a Bowl of Cherries, Why Then What Am I Doing in the Pits? And I think Aunt Irma's Cope book still stands up well, and those are my 4 favorites, or 3 of my favorites rather. And there's a book that's called 4 of a Kind, which I think collects 4 of my best books, and then Motherhood, the Second Oldest Profession. And I always have a fondness for I want to grow hair, I want to grow up, and I want to go to Boise. And it's not my best book.
How appropriate that is for this show in Idaho.
Yes. I was amazed. There was a young man with cancer who I interviewed, a child, who actually listed that as one of his life goals, was to travel to Boise. And I thought that was so very bizarre that I included it in the title of my book, because I couldn't imagine why anyone in particular living in Arizona would ever be interested in traveling to Boise, Idaho. But it was one of my, I think one of the projects that touched me the most, writing about children, battling with cancer. And their optimism, their humor, the support they had from their families, the wonderful advances that had occurred in medicine that helped these children live longer and more productive and happy lives. And so that project touched my heart, and the proceeds from that went to the American Cancer Society.
Thank you.
I don't know, it's so hard to pick from all your incredible works, your column and your books and the stories you tell. Or in 30 minutes we get just a tiny sample. But your daughter wanted a doll, and a Barbie doll, I believe.
She did.
Well, this just ran into something that was just amazing. So if you'll take a little time to tell us how that moved from a very inexpensive doll to, I believe you said in your presentation this morning that you and your daughter saved the economy of the United States.
Yes, we did. And as a matter of fact, what I would like to do is to read part of it so that I don't miss some of the funnier parts. I wrote this chapter in The Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank, and it's called Barbie and Ken. And one Christmas when we were in the department store and she noticed Barbie, she said that I said that it was amazing. Here was this stacked doll who did not burp, eat, cry, wet, walk, and who wasn't as sexless as a stick of gum. And her name was Barbie. And my daughter picked it up and said, "Mommy, this doll looks just like you." Now, I checked out the 2.5-inch bust, the 3-inch hips, and the legs that looked like 2 filter tips without tobacco and said, "She looks like she whipped through puberty in 15 minutes. I want her, my daughter whined. Now, Barbie cost $5.98 in the buff, so we purchased a little dress, a pair of pumps, a bra, and a pair of briefs that came to $6.95. My daughter wanted to know why we hadn't bought her a girdle, and I said, "Let's wait and see if she eats, and then we'll see if she needs one." But if any of us believed for a moment that Barbie was going to be happy as a simple housewife, we were in for a surprise. Barbie was a swinger, and she needed the wardrobe to do it in. Within a week, we had purchased 3 lounge outfits, $5.95 each, an entire pool ensemble, $4.95, 2 formals, $7.95 a traveling suit, $6.95 and a skating outfit for $5. Now, eventually, of course, we end up having to buy Ken because Barbie gets lonely. And then we must outfit Ken. So he has many outfits at these ridiculous prices. And one of the things I said is these little freaks were draining our budget. But I bought some patterns, and I was able to satisfy their clothing appetite by sitting at the sewing machine day and night. And then, of course, Barbie has a wedding. So we have Ken, we have Midge we have to buy because she didn't want any dolls at the wedding with bowed legs and wet diapers. But anyway, it goes on. My daughter made the comment before we bought Ken that she thought that Barbie was lonely, and that's why we needed Ken. And my suggestion was that we send her off to Camp Pendleton with her satin sheets. She was lonely.
Your cleverness in the writing was just absolutely amazing. Janelle Burke.
You entertained so many Americans, Erma Bombeck, over the years. Did your children fight? That's one of the things that many families have happened to them. They experience those sibling fights that go on at home. What did you do about that?
Oh, well, I think if you talk to any of my children, you would find they would say I was a very strict mother. And I was. My husband and I ran a household that we didn't put up with a lot of nonsense. They resented it, as most children will, and adolescents will. But as they grew up, I think they welcomed the fact that they were not just encouraged, but told that they were part of the household, which meant they had responsibilities, that they must see through to the end. And so I wasn't a a laissez-faire mom by any stretch of the imagination.
But you certainly wrote about many of the things that your family
Oh,
did.
they fought.
Christmas.
Oh, yes. And they were a typical family. We were a very typical family. The kids fought. I made the comment once that we didn't take a lot of vacations or long vacations when our children were small, because I learned after the fact that one should never have more children than there are backseat windows in a car, because whoever gets stuck in the middle is going to be the one very cranky. And so we were a very typical 50s family.
Another story, there's, again, as I'm saying, there were incredible stories, but today you also shared with the audience that you had 3 children, but you and your husband discovered that they really were 4 at the table for meals and all, and for a long period of time. And you have a name for this, and then a neighbor has a name for a child that showed up. I think that story is just so incredibly humorous. If you'd share that.
Well, I will. As a matter of fact, just so that I remember, because this was also from one of my books that I wrote, and Kenny was the name of the child who showed up in our house, and I included this because suburban children, especially in the 50s, were so nomadic. I mean, we were all stay-at-home moms, and so anyone's children was welcome in our houses. And so I wrote this little piece, and it was that and this is the way it went. My husband put down his paper at breakfast one morning and said to me, "How many children do we have?" Now, I looked at this, I put the cereal box down I was reading, and I looked around, and I said, "Well, we have 3. And he said, "How come there have been 4 children at this table for breakfast and dinner every day for months?" And I looked around, and I thought, well, okay, now this boy is ours because he has my husband's eyes, and the daughter is definitely ours because she has my coloring. But the other 2 could have been phoned in. So the only way we could tell was to ask, will the real Bombecks please stand up? And then, of course, there was a little Kenny who was left sitting at the breakfast table staring at his toast. And my husband said, "Well, son of a gun, I didn't know Kenny wasn't ours. I just apologized for not spending more time with him." And I said, well, you can imagine how angry I am. I just toilet trained him. And so when we asked him for details, we found out that he had walked in about a year ago and used the bathroom, looked around, and decided he liked the house and had just made himself at home. So I asked Kenny, "Who's your mother?" And he said, "Well, Mrs. Wicks." So I took him to Mrs. Wicks' house, and I said, "Mrs. Wicks, well, I'm bringing Kenny home." She said, "Who?" And I said, "Well, your son, Kenny." And she said, "Well, has he been acting up?" And I said, "Well, no, it's just I think he's been spending too much time with us." And she said, "Well, why do you say that?" And I said, "Well, we postponed our vacation because we couldn't find a sitter for him." So, but Mrs. Wick had this house full of children. They were all over the place, and I was beginning to feel guilty about taking Kenny home because we didn't have that many children. And as a matter of fact, she was giving Roger the, what for. She was saying, "Roger, you just can't play well with the children, and you hog all the toys, and you refuse to take your naps. And Mr. Wick and I have had a talk about you, and if you don't shape up, we're going to send you home." And that made me feel better because I thought, oh, not all of these kids are hers. And I said, "Well, thank goodness, you don't have that large family." And she said, well, none of these kids are mine. Kenny's an only child. And so I said, well, they just kind of wandered in and looked around and decided they liked it here and decided to stay. And Kenny looked around and said there were too many kids here and checked your house out and said that was just right, and he was going to stay there, and he felt more comfortable because he hated crowds. And I said, "Well, how did you know that Kenny was at our place?" And she said, "Well, I got a Christmas card from you, and Kenny was in the photographs."
Another story that you must tell, and you also talked about a neighbor. There was also another what you thought was a child by an unusual name.
Oh,
and,
yes.
Would you tell that
Oh,
story?
yes.
And then also your neighbors had a child with a similar name.
Yes. You know, after Kenny went home, we had a fourth child that moved in, but it was one I'd never seen. You know, my family kept telling me that this person existed, but I had never seen him because his name was I don't know. And he was really quite a rotten child, I have to say. You know, I'd say, who left the front door open? And the response would be, well, I don't know. And I'd ask who let the bar of soap melt down the shower drain, and it was, I don't know. And you know, I don't know lost at least 2 umbrellas, 4 pairs of shoes, and a bicycle, and had 13 books overdue at the library. And it just kept going. You know, the phone would ring, and I'd rush into the house to get the phone. My son would be putting down the receiver just as I had entered the house. And I'd say, who was that? And he'd say, I don't know. They hung up. And so, I mean, for years, we were plagued with this invisible child, I don't know. And I was telling my neighbor about it, and she says, well, we've got an invisible child, too. It's called Nobody. You know, and he says, Nobody is worse than Dennis the Menace. I mean, he tears the paper up before people can see it. He breaks dishes. You know, he about knocked me senseless when I was carpooling the kids, you know, with a baseball bat. And I mean, I just... I said I just didn't know how much longer I could stand, I don't know, living with us. And then one night I was sitting at the dinner table, my husband and I were talking, and I said, well, I'm planning dinner for tomorrow, and how do you feel about liver? And he looked up and he said, I don't care. And the only thing I could figure was that I was really in for it because I don't know, must have a brother.
Oh, just so powerful humor out of such reality. Janelle Burke.
Mrs. Bombeck, your husband played a role in your career and in your writing. Tell us about him. What kind of man was he?
Bill was probably the most supportive and caring husband that a woman could ever ask for. He was, when I started writing my column at Wit's End and when I needed to go out on the road to promote my books, I mean, Bill was always there for me. When I had my cancer surgery and had not a radical mastectomy, but part of a breast removed, I was worried. You know, he came to the hospital, and I was just chattering away like a used car salesman, you know, trying to sell him a bill of goods, I guess, and because I was afraid of his reaction, and he was just the most loving man. He also became my business manager. He took over a lot of the work involved with arranging road trips and keeping the accounts, so I didn't have to worry about that part of the business.
He also played a role in your writings, though. You consulted him frequently.
Well, Bill and I were partners in that, yes. And in fact, all of my family ends up in some way, shape, form, or manner as characters in my work. I say this is fiction, and yes, I exaggerate many of the instances to get a laugh. But yes, he was Bill and I were very close. And so we consulted on everything from raising children to my writing.
Well, you also had an interesting relationship with your mother, and again, you used the humor there. And I do not want the show to end without talking about the fruitcake.
Oh, the fruitcake. My mother loves fruitcake. Now, I absolutely despise fruitcake. I don't think I'll ever encounter a piece of fruitcake I would like. As I tell you, I've tested at least 10,000 species of fruitcake, and none of them have been edible, in my opinion. I always consider fruitcake the one pit in the Christmas cherry. Fruitcake, it defies all culinary rules, I think. I mean, no one ever says to you, this fruitcake is the lightest a fruitcake you will ever have eaten. It will just melt in your mouth because the heavier the better. And in fact, the fruitcake should weigh more than the oven in which it was baked to be really good fruitcake. In fact, I was eating a piece, I'm trying to eat a piece once, one of my mother's many fruitcake recipes she's trying to pass off on me, and I was afraid I was going to drop a crumb on my foot and end up in the hospital. But, it's just, fruitcake is the pit in the Christmas holiday is fruitcake.
And throughout your life, you never did find a recipe that would match that?
I have never found a recipe for fruitcake that can even tolerate. They're just all of these weird, incompatible fruits. And have you noticed how weird the colors are in them, too? Who's ever seen a piece of pineapple that's green? I mean, it's just, it's very bizarre to look at as well as to eat.
But your mother never was convinced that fruitcake was not.
No, because
that was essential. That was a tradition at Christmas.
Traditional. It was essential, and my mother was going to give me advice whether I wanted it or not. I've always said that about mothers. They're going to give you advice, and it doesn't make any difference whether you say yes or no. If you want it, you're going to get it anyway. So
on that note, I have to bring the program up to the point of we're going to come out of character now, and I want to introduce the real person here, and that is Denise Clark. And you've seen her on this program a number of times because she, with some of our other colleagues, do every fall book reviews. And Denise Clark is a librarian at North Idaho College, and she holds degrees from 2 universities, a bachelor's and a master's. And I've often said of Denise that she is the most intelligent person I have met because you can't talk about any book that she doesn't know. Denise, in the little time we have left, I know you do Mother Jones, you've done a number of characters, and you really enjoyed doing this one, didn't you?
I did. I this woman was such a delightful person. I read a couple of biographies of her, and I watched a DVD that's produced by Think Television out of Dayton, Ohio, which is now available in the NIC library, by the way. And I just grew to become very fond of this woman. She was right here at the right time. She made fun of housework. Thank goodness. I mean, finally, someone, was able to say that housework has its, funny side. That wasn't possible in the 50s.
And she just touched a topic that everyone understands, from the whole family and all perspective.
Right.
And I was there this morning. Of course, you had a very large crowd, and we're taping this program in March, and that is when this symposium took place. And Denise, again, thank you so much. You were a delight both this morning and on this program. You did a masterful job. I know you spent months researching. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will continue to be with us through this series. This was number 4, and it's a rather long series titled Celebrating Humor and Music, Conversation with Comedians and Musicians in the Past. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.